I've been making pottery for about 5 years now, and I made a lot of mistakes when I first started. Though I took several classes and watched tons of YouTube videos on repeat to teach myself pottery, there were a lot of things that these experienced potters just didn't even mention. It seemed like they had forgotten what it was like to be a beginner. So here are 6 things I wish I knew when I first started learning pottery that I think would have really helped me get started. Number 1, soft clay is easier to center. I remember really struggling with learning how to center clay. Videos would advise not to use too much water and that all you had to do was brace yourself against the clay. But this never worked for me, and I remember my hands and wrists being so tired after just throwing one pot. It wasn't until another more experienced potter in my studio told me that the issue was I actually needed to use more water because my clay was so hard. With his advice, I ended up trying a different kind of clay, and that's when I realized that soft clay is way easier to use. And suddenly all those videos I saw of potters coning up and coning down made sense because they were using really soft clay. Many beginner classes use cheap old clay that's been sitting around, and it isn't as soft as fresh clay. This can make centering way more challenging because the clay is harder than it needs to be. So if you're struggling to center your clay, try switching to a softer clay. This could be fresh clay out of a new bag, or by mixing wet clay in with your existing clay. Number 2, there is no right or wrong way to throw on the wheel. I've noticed that potters can be really judgmental, and I've heard of teachers being quite strict in their teaching approaches for beginners. But as long as it works and feels comfortable for you, it shouldn't matter. Now, of course, it's good to try the teacher's techniques since they are the ones teaching you. However, I do recommend adjusting their approach to do what's most comfortable for you. For example, some potters don't recommend using sponges while throwing the wheel. However, at least for me, I found that throwing with a sponge is always much more comfortable because the clay that I like to use can be quite sticky. Another example is the positioning of your hands when you're opening up the clay. Some potters recommend 2 fingers to pull it towards yourself. Other potters use 2 thumbs and pull in different directions. And there really is no right or wrong way to do this. The important thing is to experiment and figure out what's most comfortable for you, and also yields the best results. Number 3, throwing thinner is not always better. Now, when you're first starting out, one of the biggest challenges you're going to face, aside from centering, is making your walls too thick. And of course, it's every potter's goal to try to make thinner walls. However, depending on what you're making, thinner walls might not always be better. For example, planters are actually better with thicker walls because it makes them more steady. Plates, if they're too thin, will feel fragile and you might not want to use them. So keep in mind what you're making and think about whether thinner walls or thicker walls are better. Number 4, finish even the bad pieces because there's more to pottery than just throwing. Throwing on the wheel is only the first part of the pottery process. You will still need to learn how to trim and glaze, and to do that, you're going to have pieces to test on. So even if you don't like that bad wonky piece, it might be a really good piece to practice trimming a really nice foot ring on or testing out a new glaze. The other benefit is that you won't be as attached to these pieces. So if you accidentally trim through the bottom of your piece or the glaze comes out really weird, you're not going to feel as bad because it was only a test piece anyway. This leads straight into number 5, which is don't become too attached to your pieces and to expect the unexpected. Now, I know that this is much easier than said, and when I was first starting out, every single piece I made felt just so precious. However, it is really common that pieces will not come out as you expect. Even after 5 years of experience, sometimes pieces come out different than what I wanted. Hairline cracks can appear after the final firing, glazes might look different than you expected. And as a beginner, those moments can feel really devastating. However, if you can learn to detach yourself from the perfection as a beginner, you're going to enjoy pottery a lot more. I remember one of the very first pieces I made ended up with a bunch of weird glaze smudges because I didn't know how to glaze, and I just felt so sad about it. But my teacher looked at this piece with different eyes, and he thought it looked amazing. It had a really rustic look, and it felt really unique. And it made me actually feel better and see it with new eyes. Because even though it didn't turn out as I expected, it actually did look really good for what it became. So if a piece doesn't come out as you expected or even breaks after the final firing, try to look at it instead as a stepping stone to where you're going, because the next piece that you're going to make is going to be so much better than the last one. And for number 6, which is the last one because I couldn't think of more, make sure that you keep some of the first pieces that you make, even if you hate them. One of the great things about pottery is that you can very easily see your progress. While I didn't keep many of them, I do have some of my very first pieces, and it's quite fun to see how far I've come. The first piece pieces I made were really squat and really heavy because the bottoms of them were so thick, and I didn't know how to pull up walls. It's also just fun to see how that espresso cup that you accidentally made when you're trying to make a mug compares to the mug that you can make several years later. Pottery is really challenging, and when you're just starting out, making bigger and more complicated things can seem impossible when you're struggling with just the basics like centering clay. But by keeping these old pieces, you can see where you started, and suddenly those impossible things become things you can actually reach with enough time and practice. So if you're just starting out with pottery, I hope these things can help you learn with less frustration and make it more enjoyable. Because in the end, it's an art form, and while not always relaxing, it's at least supposed to be fun.